Many of my favorite games lately have been soft reboots. That's interesting, but is it sustainable? Let's talk about it. If we're being honest, the term soft reboot doesn't quite apply to games nearly as well as it does to movies, TV shows, or books. What it actually means is a contrast of a hard reboot, for which we take The Batman as compared to Batman the Dark Knight trilogy, as compared to Batman and Robin, as compared to... you get it. Each of these iterations are developing a new and altered narrative of who Batman is and what are the rules of the universe that contains this Gotham and its characters. In each version, the last doesn't exist. Ironically, the Spider-Man movies would have been the perfect example for this until, well, they weren't anymore. This is a hard reboot. A soft reboot is best seen in Jurassic World or Ghostbusters Afterlife. A new story and new beginning, but in the same continuity as the former works. So much so that the trailer for Jurassic World Dominion has the classic characters side by side with the new ones. This is the technical definition and is generally easy to define when the medium itself is easy to define, which is less true of games. Even a complete tonal shift like Thor Ragnarok as compared to Thor 1 and 2 may be a soft reboot in terms of, franchise identity and value proposition, but it's well and clear that this is a sequel through and through. Now compare this to games, where the rest of our conversation will live. A major difference between games and other media is gameplay. In many ways, the purpose of any kind of reboot is to cater not only to your existing audience, but provide a clean entry point for newcomers, so no one has to ask,
do I need to play Dragon Quest 1 through 10 before playing 11?
But because of gameplay, by and large, reboots here will fit the function of other media, but not necessarily the formula. One example of an exception to this is God of War, which sees Kratos start an entire new journey with the 2018 game God of War. However, it's still tied to the canon of the pre-existing sequel. Even here though, the story elements of the reboot would be almost meaningless to reach new audiences outside of how it ties in with the gameplay. Even if just the story started over in the exact same way as this game and set up the future of the franchise, just like that game did with God of War Ragnarok on the horizon, some of the fan base would likely still call the game God of War 4. In this case, it's not the story that sets the new game apart from the others, it is the gameplay, which is all the more true with most other series. Take a recent example, and one of my favorite games so far of 2022, Kirby and the Forgotten Lands. I would argue that this is functionally a soft reboot, even though at its core, it's a perfectly natural evolution of existing gameplay and lore, which should make it more of a standard sequel. The primary differentiator between this Kirby game and the former outings of the pink puffball turns omnipotent deity is the perspective shift from 2D, or at times 2.5D, to 3D, even if somewhat isometric with a largely fixed camera. This shift cannot be overstated, as it is one of the key factors that enabled this game to likely outperform the rest of the entire series in terms of sales and consumer mindshare. For better or worse, and from anecdotal evidence, games being in 3D are often viewed as having a baseline higher quality than their side-scrolling counterparts. This doesn't take into effect the game design itself, as there's no mistaking the 2D Celeste, for example, as a worse game than the laughable, critically panned 3D game Room in the Night Sky or Superman 64 or any asset dump game that shows up on the eShop. Similarly, Metroid Dread, despite being rendered in 3D, is playable from a side-scrolling perspective and was often called out as a game that shouldn't cost a full $60 for this fact alone, when it was one of the best games of 2021. But to bring it back to Kirby, this is one major factor that has enabled this game to act as a reboot commercially, in effect giving it a new identity to the public, outside of existing or observant fans who are able to see that the core gameplay is just refined and extrapolated upon, which is the best of both worlds. A couple additions that were made more possible because of this perspective shift, however, or at least enacted in conjunction with it, would be the hub area of Waddle Dee Town, which acts similarly to a home menu in some other Kirby games, like housing minigames, entry of codes, boss rush, a way to view collectibles, and a bunch more. Furthermore, the ability to upgrade your abilities. Also, combat in 3D now includes blocking, and the dodge slowdown or witch time thing from Bayonetta, or flurry rush from Breath of the Wild. And aside from other additions, the big one is mouthful mode. Turn into a car, into a vending machine, into a cone, an air circle, a stairs. The world is your oyster, and you will eat that oyster and attack your enemies with its pearls. In short, HAL Laboratories seems to have gone back to the drawing board for this game and asked themselves what works and what needs refinement. And at least in a marketing and audience perspective sense alone, this feels like a new start for Kirby, which I would argue is functionally a reboot, but it does bring up some long-term questions. Take Pokemon Legends Arceus. In most ways, this game rethought and revolutionized what it means to be a Pokemon game more than most before it. To double down on the gameplay example though, the formula of the game of visiting various areas, defeating unique kinds of challenges, not having gyms, that's all fairly similar to Pokemon Sun and Moon, as AJ pointed out on our podcast a couple of weeks ago, which you should check out every Saturday if you're into that kind of thing. But despite Pokemon Sun and Moon having a different structure to the standard 8 gyms and Elite Four ordeal, it wasn't praised for its originality and didn't bring in any more new fans than any other generation does. But bring that format to Legends Arceus, where the minute-to-minute gameplay is rethought from the ground up, and suddenly you've got a game that I've heard many old Pokemon fans, myself included, say they haven't had this much fun with a Pokemon game in decades. And then examples like my wife, who has come to really enjoy Pokemon broadly, but wasn't interested in the games until she played and fell in love with Legends Arceus, up until the sluggish endgame, that is. The new focus on gameplay-driven ideas, suddenly being able to sneak up on Pokemon and throw Pokeballs in the overworld, walking around while your Pokemon battles, teaching new moves on the fly, gathering resources and crafting with them, and so many other things, all enabled this experience to feel magical for the first time in a while, rather than stale. But here's the long-term question I alluded to: how long can that last? Taking Zelda as the prime example of a structure that got tired and formulaic by the time Skyward Sword came around, when Breath of the Wild released, it served as the perfect reboot for the franchise. The gameplay ideas were new and inventive for the Zelda fanbase and newcomers alike, even if it did throw out a few more traditions than part of the core fanbase agreed should have gone. But its status as a brand new start for the series is undeniable. With new gameplay and fresh, modern ideas came great reception. Looking ahead though is the sequel, which will certainly have tons of brand new ideas and mechanics, but will be built on a similar concept as the original. There is a great chance that the sequel to Breath of the Wild will be a technically better game, possibly in every way, but it still can't recapture the magic of the first to most. This way of developing the franchise is familiar to Zelda, and I'm genuinely curious what comes after this game. Funnily enough, one of the biggest departures in the 3D Zelda legacy is the other immediate sequel, Majora's Mask. And looking at a similar example, but with a franchise on the opposite end of the spectrum, Mario Galaxy and Mario Galaxy 2 follow a similar trend to what I imagine will be true of Breath of the Wild. In my opinion, Mario Galaxy 2 is the better of the two games and takes a lot of what it does well directly from the first, then adding on to it. But for those who played Galaxy 1 first, that game will likely feel like a better game because of the wonder associated with it as compared to its direct sequel. I say this example is opposite though because 3D Mario has much more of a propensity to try to reboot in basically every game to somewhat varied success, but always some variety of success nonetheless. This is in stark contrast to the more recent 2D games though. New Super Mario Bros. On the DS was legitimately a reboot and well received, as it was the first 2D Mario game since Super Mario World. And sure, multiplayer 2D Mario was neat on the Wii, but after that, it got stale. And now here we are almost 2 decades later, and besides the ability to create your own levels with Mario Maker, the series is still due for some kind of reimagining. One last franchise to examine is Star Fox. Basically every entry in that series was some variety of reboot, but instead of rejuvenating a concept that's seen its logical conclusion, it was more about trying to find its intended vision. Star Fox 2, once it finally released decades later, and Star Fox 64 were on-rails shooters through and through with, some deviations when appropriate. The series' identity felt pretty set in stone for a time there. Then Star Fox Adventure, a completely different gameplay style, basically a 3D Zelda but on Dinosaur Planet with our Star Fox friends. Star Fox Assault, part on rails and part on foot shooter missions. Star Fox Command, back in the R-Wing but with a fairly different gameplay loop. And then Star Fox Zero, which is the most classic reboot of the franchise as it intends to bring the series back to its roots but with new controls. But none of these games had all that much commercial success. Nintendo was hoping they'd eventually stick the landing on one of these, but seemingly didn't have a clear vision for this Fox and his friends. Arguably though, I think in this case, this was the right approach. They never found their golden goose, but if they do, then Star Fox 2 joins the conversation with the rest of these games. And theorizing about that for a minute, we'd think that if they do find that formula, I'd want them to make that game as best as possible and then scrap it for the next game, if reboots are really all that, right? Well, thinking especially about Star Fox and our titular example Kirby, I think I actually don't. Growing up, I played Kirby's Dream Land 2 and basically haven't been interested in many Kirby games since then. That's not to say the series hasn't been successful and found its own identity time and again in several decades in its existence, but with Kirby and the Forgotten Lands, I think HAL Laboratories found a way to cater to the existing audience and also to anyone at all who thinks they might be interested. And yet, within this one game, or the ideas that come out of this game, there's so much more potential. The same could have been said of Mario Galaxy into Mario Galaxy 2. Nintendo had so many great ideas that they made a whole new game to be able to explore them. And as I said, I think it's the better of the two games for it. It's definitely important to shake up the formula and go back to the drawing board when a series becomes stale or ideas aren't as easily actionable. But until that point, why not squeeze everything you can out of a particular formula before moving on to the next? I would suggest like 3 or 4 games seems like a reasonable cadence before doing some kind of reboot, but it also depends from series to series, from game to game. In short, I think these reboots and complete gameplay shifts are some of the strongest tools that game developers have up their sleeves to turn a stagnant series back into an exciting one. But up the other sleeve is the power of introducing twists and variations on existing formulas that we'd never see coming. Between these is a balancing act. But I hope that Nintendo, with various franchises that sit on one side or another of this duality, continues to not be afraid to venture into that other side. I think Pokemon is one series that, although it had some major changes in Pokemon Legends Arceus, stands to be reworked fully from the ground up to even greater potential critical and commercial success. And on that note, check out this video from AJ dipping his toes into that topic, as we hope to make a whole video series of that sort for Pokemon when our Patreon reaches a certain goal. Thanks so much for watching. Peace and blessings.